Well, hello everyone. I'm Joe Lane and I'm the president and CEO of Lane LifeTrans. I felt during these scary times that it would be important to let the community know a little bit about what we have been doing in our position as a primary care pre-hospital provider of emergency medical services. Okay, we're an ambulance, but we're a paramedic ambulance, and we normally respond in a year's time to 27,000 trips. We don't transport that many, but we respond that many times. So in that area of Mahoning and Trumbull County that we cover, our staff is exposed to a lot more potential cases where they could end up with a quarantine or actually end up with the COVID-19 virus. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I sit here talking because I'm really impressed with what the folks of Lane LifeTrans are doing, what our dispatchers are doing, what our management team is doing, what the day-to-day medics and EMTs are doing. It doesn't get said necessarily, it's something that perhaps is expected, but I didn't want to go through this thing and not talk about what they're doing and what we've had to do since this thing started a while ago. In the early days of the virus outbreak, we, like everyone else in the area, all the first responders, weren't sure exactly how this thing was going to pan out. Our chief and assistant chief and our supervisors and all our support staff, got together, put their heads together, and began developing a way to deal with this crisis from the front lines. We weren't sure exactly how many cases we were going to have to deal with or how many exposures might actually happen for our crews and for our staff. One of the very first cases that we had to deal with was in all the papers, and so it's okay for me to talk about it because it was in the news and it was on TV. But at Arconic in Niles, they had a situation where a person was non-responsive. We respond to Arconic, and we responded there as Lane LifeTrans, and we responded along with Weathersfield Fire Department. All we knew is we had a person who was non-responsive, and our medics went in and began to assess the situation and began to do what they have to do in those situations with the patient. Unfortunately, it was not a successful outcome as far as saving the patient. That is always one bad thing about this that no one ever forgets. But as time went by then, and after this case was reviewed, we realized that we may have possibly been exposed to the COVID virus. Because of that, at that point in time and since then, based on the parameters of how we knew the disease was working, or the infection was working, I should say, our staff was quarantined for 2 weeks. And at that point in time, I lost our chief of operations of Lane LifeTrans, I lost the director of our dispatch center, I lost our paramedic supervisor, and 2 other EMTs who were on that call, and they all went into quarantine. That was when it first really hit us that, wow, is this thing real? It is really real. And in the next few days, we had a few more exposures, and this, of course, caused us to, one, revamp our management team and really load them up with a lot of responsibility while everyone was in quarantine, but to also reassess how we were going to do things. And so that's what we did. My chief and assistant chief and the supervisors and everyone else with their input came up with ways to handle this going forward. As they luckily got out of quarantine and the other folks got out of quarantine, we were able to reassess again the way we were going to deliver our services. Now, you may have heard it, but what we have to be really concerned about as first responders is PPE, personal protective equipment. That is critical to keep our EMTs and paramedics and our staff safe in case of a potential exposure. We had the equipment, we've always had it. We've gone through other situations in the past where we needed to be geared up for that sort of work, and we had the equipment, and we started developing our standards for use of that equipment. What we realized was it was going to go fast. And as the crisis ramped up, and as the virus was shown to be much more nasty than perhaps originally thought, we realized that we may be in a situation at some point where we are not going to have sufficient PPE for our staff. And at that point, we became like everyone else in the first responder roles, we became really heavily engaged in looking for sources and resources for personal protective equipment. We have found some, and we are, again, still shaking the trees, as they say, to see what else we can come up with. But the type of equipment that we used, in order to help just use it when it was really needed, and with the size and volume of our company, we decided that we had to see what's the safest way to protect our people. We couldn't put everybody in the highest level PPE for every trip they go on, or we'd be out in short order. And what people forget about is during these times, all the other emergencies that paramedics have to respond to are still going on. We're still having people with heart attacks. We're having people having strokes. We're having people that get in car accidents. I mean, all these things go on. So they're still responding to those situations. Now, do they need protective gear in those? Not the highest level, no, but there is a level of protection that's certainly necessary because we don't know who's been exposed. So what we've done is we've basically decided at different levels of protection for our people. There are these different levels of equipment, which I can show you, which makes it a lot easier to understand how far each step is as we decide whether or not we need to go fully protected at the highest level on a certain trip. The trips that we go on now are basically covered by our dispatchers, who've been doing a fantastic job, because they have to try and determine what type of trip it is from the beginning. And that can help our people as they're responding. As a 911 provider, they need to have some idea of how bad the situation is, whether a supervisor needs to follow in with them, make secondary determinations if we need to actually bring in the full PPE for that situation. And then if that happens, we now have specifically designated COVID-19 vehicles. We put one together in the early days of this thing, and then we since then have added 2 more. So we now have 3 COVID vehicles. And when you look at them, you'll see that they're basically covered on the entire inside with a visqueen type material to seal off the back of that vehicle, so that after transport it can be cleaned, sprayed, and allowed to sit and do the killing off of the virus, and then it's ready to go again. That's been a real challenge, to basically have 2 more vehicles added to the one that we had. And so we are continuing to utilize those vehicles every day. But the safety equipment, again, now is still a concern, and I probably will say that 10 times while I'm talking to you today. Now, what we've realized as this virus has just started to ramp up is that this area has turned out to be one of the hotbeds for the number of cases in Ohio. Because of that, again, we've gotten very concerned about the equipment that we have available. And we've also gotten very concerned about the number of calls we're going on, period, because since we do have to handle all those other calls, the heart attacks, the strokes, all those other things that we have to deal with, we've got to make sure that we have personnel available for those calls. One of the things I would ask people is to be very cautious in deciding to dial 911 and call for an ambulance. In the past, the 911 system was often overburdened by people calling for things that were really not an emergency. And you have to seriously think about that now. We have to keep the ambulances available. What I would ask people to do is make sure it's really an emergency before you call 911. We don't need to have our folks exposed to someone who maybe did have an exposure to a COVID patient, doesn't know it, and they call us for something that's not even an emergency. We really don't want that to happen. So we're trying on our end to use our resources wisely. And that's us and all first responders. We're all trying to do that. We're trying to minimize our exposure, but when people really need us, certainly we will be there. One of the things that's come up also during this time are when we have a patient family and we go to a house and someone has to go into the hospital and it's a true emergency or a serious COVID case, we cannot allow the family members to ride in the ambulance with us. And what happens then, families can get upset, spouses, children can get upset because they can't go with us. And that does become a problem for them, because they realize if they go in and they do have to be admitted because it's very serious, then they may not get to see that person, because if they get quarantined, that's it. And so it's really tough on families and on patients' relatives or friends to have to allow us to put them in the vehicle and then take them to the hospital, and they can't ride with us. In the old days, when we didn't have this looming, we certainly could allow a family member to ride in with us and that sort of thing, and we just can't do that anymore. My staff and our management team would ask the families out there to understand that we're not trying to be mean. We're not trying to do anything that in any way, shape, or form is going to keep you from your family, but we're just doing what's best for everyone, your family, and for the people that are providing the service. We have to keep these medics and EMTs on the road. We need to do that. We need to keep them healthy and keep the wheels rolling. Every day, we get a report from both Trumbull County and Mahoning County. What that is the Emergency Operations Center report. And the Emergency Operations Center report that we receive each day gives us a lot of data. It tells us the situation. It's a situation report, basically, that has been assembled by fire service predominantly in both counties. Trumbull County was put theirs together, and then Mahoning County put theirs together. They're very similar. There's some overlap, but it's very important that we all have the information that comes from those reports. It lets us know where we stand as far as the number of cases that we're dealing with and whether those numbers are going up or down. So that's really important. And it also serves as a resource for finding personal protective equipment and other things, helping deal with quarantine situations with employees, with paramedics or EMTs or other first responders. It helps with solving that potential problem. Again, what they're really doing now is looking ahead that if this thing really ramps up more than it is at this point, that we will be in place in both Mahoning and Trumbull County to deal with that. And I applaud all the parties involved with that. They're doing great work, and it's very, very involved and extremely informative, and we see it every morning. And I'm sure that will continue until this thing is over. With respect to the people that are out there doing the work, the men and women, the EMTs and paramedics that are out there every day on the front lines of this thing, they are really stepping up. I can't believe how much they have taken to heart their commitment to this valley. It's amazing when I saw the responses I got from the first group of people that were quarantined, that they wanted to get back at it. They wanted to get back in the game. They wanted to get back in the fight. To know that these folks feel that way should really make you feel proud of this valley and should really make you feel confident that no one is going to let you down. They're going to be there. They're going to continue to do what they're doing, and you can expect them to ride this thing out. These are great people. If you see them out there, give them a wave. You know, we don't want you getting too close, but give them a wave, give them a high sign, and let them know that you appreciate what they're doing. I know I sure do, and everybody out there should. So when you see the first responders out there, let them know you appreciate it. Give them that nod and let them know. When the first group of first responders that we had was quarantined, we were in a position where we only had 2 members of management left. We had to ask them to take on all the burden of running the whole operation in the 2 counties where we function, in that 120 square miles we cover and 120 or 30,000 people that we're responsible for. We had to throw it on their shoulders. I'll tell you what, those 2 ladies did a great job. I don't think they slept much for 2 weeks, but every time I saw them, they were smiling and they were making it happen. And it says a lot for them, and again, their commitment to this valley. And it also says a lot to the other EMTs and paramedics that we have in our company, that they knew this situation was what it was. And they knew that they had just a couple people that were really acting as management, and everybody did what they had to do, and we got through it until we got people back on the street again. And so I can't say enough about how Robin and Judy really stepped up and did a great job while a lot of people were staying at home and just wanting to get back at it. So again, thank you to them for stepping up and really doing a great job. During the first quarantine, I don't believe I mentioned that besides my chief, Tom Lambert, and then the manager of the dispatch center and 2 other EMTs. I also had my son quarantined because he was the supervisor on that call. The communications with folks during that quarantine showed how much they, or how, not how much, but how they were dealing with it. I know Tom, as the chief of Lane Life Trans, Tom had to try and work from home, but he did it, and I think he got tired of talking on his phone. I think he spent a lot of hours on the phone, and every day, all day. It was a challenge. He even did a couple interviews by FaceTime with the press and talked about the situation. But those 2 weeks seemed like a year for all of them, but they got through it okay, and we're glad to have them back in the saddle, as the saying goes. And I'm sure they don't want to have to go through that again, and let's hope they don't. Now, when I'm talking about the COVID prepped vehicles, the first one that we set up was one of our vehicles, which we set up, as I said, with the Visqueen on the inside, set up so that the back end of it was completely, basically sealed and protected and able to be cleaned efficiently after use. When we saw that we were going to need more than one of those, that was going to be a challenge because we were still responding to all these other trips that we respond to in the valley here. We were lucky enough to be able to utilize a truck that Austintown Fire Department had that was not in service, that we were able to re-outfit and get approval by the state to put into service as a second COVID truck. So our thanks to Chief Andy Frost and Austintown Fire for helping coordinate that, and we got that up and running. So that gave us the second one. Now, the third one then came from McDonald. We provide paramedic backup for McDonald Fire Department, and they had an extra vehicle, which they then decided they would turn into a COVID truck. And that truck was also set up so that we could utilize that. So that's how we got basically 3 COVID trucks in the works and able to be utilized. That took some of the stress off of us because of concerns over delays and overexposure perhaps for one squad versus another. The utilization of those extra cars and the help from the fire departments there has just been fantastic, so we really appreciate that. One of the other challenges that we've had is, in order to try to keep people safe and minimize exposure, a lot of the we'll call it mutual aid that we have in the valley, we've had to tone back. We've had to cut it back. If it isn't really necessary, we don't bring in extra people. That is either from another company, from fire service. We've minimized that and tried to really keep that from happening unless it's really something bad that requires multiple hands. We have tried to manage that type of situation with our own people as much as possible. There still are situations where we do get support from fire or from another ambulance company, but we tried to minimize that so we don't expose those folks any more than we absolutely have to. So that's changed things a bit, and it's put a lot more on our shoulders as far as just making sure we also protect our people and try to handle everything ourselves without overburdening our system. And so far we've been able to do it, and the mutual aid and assistance when it's been needed has come, and everybody's done a great job. And then we again just try to keep the exposures less than necessary. So we have to protect all our resources, and we're all looking out for each other, that's for sure. When our folks have been on quarantine, one of the tough things that they've had to deal with for many of them has been, they're part of a family. They have a spouse, they have children. If they're quarantined, then the kids have to go somewhere and the spouse may have to go somewhere, or the alternative, they have to go somewhere. That can be a challenge and has been a challenge. It's been resolved so far, but we are concerned that down the road, if it gets to a time when there are more calls and more exposures, what can we do to try to keep people from going home when they're quarantined? As I come to a close here today, I really want to make it clear that I have the most confidence that we will get through this thing, and that I can promise you that Lane Life Trans will do everything it can do to continue to serve this valley at the highest standards possible and as safely as possible, and that we will do that by protecting our people and protecting the people that we serve as an ambulance provider. We're going to be here. They've told me, the people that work here have told me, they're here. They know they've got to do this. And I firmly believe that they will, and that you can count on them. And I feel that that thought process, that commitment, is something that we have going on all across this country. And I just want everyone listening to this to know that I really do believe that we will get through this thing, and that we're going to be here when it's all done, and we'll all be able to say we did everything we possibly could to get through this and move on into better times.